July 26th, 1944. A sunken lane near Saint-Lô. Inside the stifling heat of a Panzer IV, Lieutenant Franz Kappel watched the hedgerows simmer. His gunner, Steiner, a veteran decorated for his work on the Eastern Front, pressed his eye to the magnificent Zeiss optic. They were hunters, their 75mm Quark-A, 40 cannon loaded and waiting for the prey. American M4 Shermans. The Germans called them Ronsons, confident in their ability to ignite the gasoline-powered tanks with a single, well-placed shot. Doctrine was simple. Wait for the clumsy American machines to halt, then fire. As a column of Shermans rumbled into view, Steiner's voice was calm. Targets acquired. They move like tractors. Kappel watched the lead tank lurching over the uneven ground, but his confidence evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. Something was wrong. The American tank's gun barrel was not swaying. It remained unnervingly level, a steel finger pointing directly at them, defying the very laws of physics as they understood them. To understand the German shock, one must first understand the brutal science of tank warfare in 1944. For the German Panzerwaffe, combat was a duelist's art, perfected on the Eastern Front. Their doctrine was built upon a foundation of technological superiority and tactical patience. The German war machine had produced two of the most formidable fighting vehicles of the war, the Panzer V Panther and the Panzer VI Tiger. These were not merely tanks, they were legends, engineered with an almost fanatical attention to detail. The Tiger, with its monstrous 88mm cannon, could kill Allied tanks from over a mile away, long before the enemy was even in range. Its armor was so thick that Sherman crews were told the only way to guarantee a kill was to hit it from the side or rear, an often suicidal proposition. The Panther was arguably the more dangerous opponent, a perfect synthesis of speed, armor, and firepower. Its sloped frontal armor was nearly as effective as the Tiger's, and its long-barreled 75mm cannon had a higher velocity than even the Tiger's 88mm gun, allowing it to slice through Allied armor with contemptuous ease. German tank crews were an elite force, rigorously trained and blooded in years of combat. Their confidence was immense. They knew their machines were better. Their optics, manufactured by Zeiss, were the best in the world, allowing for unparalleled accuracy at range. Their entire tactical philosophy was built around these strengths: find a superior position, remain concealed, and destroy the enemy from a safe distance using precision gunnery. They viewed the American M4 Sherman tank with disdain, seeing it as a crude, mass-produced tool for a nation that understood industry but not warfare. They laughed at its thin, vertical armor and high profile, calling it a Ronson because it lit up so easily when hit. They knew the Americans would have more tanks, but they firmly believed that German quality would always triumph over American quantity. This supreme confidence was the bedrock of their morale, the psychological armor that was, in its own way, as strong as the steel plate on their Panthers. It was this bedrock of certainty that was about to be shattered in the hedgerows of France, not by a bigger gun or thicker armor, but by a small, unassuming piece of technology they never knew existed. The American approach to armored warfare was fundamentally different. Where German engineers pursued perfection, American industry pursued overwhelming adequacy. The United States military planners understood they would be fighting a war thousands of miles from home, across two oceans. They didn't need a perfect tank. They needed a good enough tank that was mechanically reliable, easy to repair with interchangeable parts, and simple enough to be produced on an unprecedented scale. The M4 Sherman was the embodiment of this philosophy. Its Ford GAA-58 engine was a masterpiece of reliability compared to the over-engineered German power plants that were prone to breakdowns. While a German Panther might be stranded for days waiting for a specialized recovery vehicle and a team of factory technicians, a Sherman could often be repaired in the field within hours. This industrial might was something the German High Command could comprehend, but not truly appreciate. By 1944, American factories were producing a new Sherman tank roughly every 30 minutes. For every Panther that rolled out of a German factory, dozens of Shermans were being loaded onto ships. The Americans weren't just deploying tanks, they were deploying a mobile, self-sustaining ecosystem of logistics and repair that the German war machine could no longer match. But within this flood of steel was a secret ingredient: American designers weren't just focused on quantity, they were obsessed with giving their crews a practical, decisive edge. They recognized that most tank battles were not long-range duels across open fields, but chaotic, close-range brawls. In these fights, the crew that could get the first accurate shot off would win. This was the problem the Westinghouse Gyrostabilizer was designed to solve. It was a sophisticated piece of technology that German engineers had experimented with, but abandoned as too complex for mass production. The Americans, however, perfected it. They created a simple, robust system and then did something the Germans thought impossible. They installed it as standard equipment in nearly every Sherman they built. German intelligence never expected this. They saw the Sherman's simple exterior and assumed the interior was equally crude. They were shocked to discover that this Ronson was in some ways more technologically advanced than their own revered Panzers. For the American tanker, the Gyrostabilizer was a quiet hum in a world of violent noise. Outside the turret, the 50-caliber machine gun roared, tracks clattered against steel, and the Ford V8 engine thundered. The tank itself would lurch, pitch, and roll, throwing the crew against the hard steel walls. Yet for the gunner, looking through his sight, the world was uncannily calm. While the tank's hull dropped into a ditch, his crosshairs would only dip slightly before the stabilizer, like a ghostly hand, lifted the cannon and his viewpoint back onto the target. This gave the American crew an almost surreal sense of detachment and confidence. They were taught to trust the hum, to let the machine do the work. In training, they learned to fire on the move, a skill their enemies considered impossible. This ability to fight back while advancing transformed their role from that of a vulnerable target into an aggressive predator. They were no longer just driving a Ronson, they were aiming a weapon that could strike at any moment, and this psychological shift was as important as the technology itself. The technological angle, the whispering gyroscope, the Westinghouse stabilizer was a marvel of pragmatic American engineering. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't perfect. It only corrected for vertical movement, the pitching up and down of the tank's hull. The gunner, known as the turret turner, still had to manually traverse the turret left and right. But the vertical plane was where the most violent and disorienting movements occurred. The system worked using a small, electrically powered gyroscope that spun at thousands of RPMs. Much like a spinning top that resists being tilted, the gyro provided a stable reference point. When the tank's hull dipped, the gyro would sense the change and instantly activate a hydraulic pump, which adjusted the gun's elevation to keep it perfectly level. A gunner described it as being like an expert waiter carrying a tray of drinks across a heaving deck while his body swayed. His arm and hand made thousands of tiny adjustments to keep the tray perfectly flat. The Germans had the better optics, but the Americans had the steadier platform, a trade-off that proved decisive. The enemy point of view, reports of ghosts. The first reports trickling back to German command were dismissed as battlefield exaggeration or isolated incidents of luck. A German Hauptmann from the Panzer Lehr division noted in his journal, Feldwebel Schmidt reports being fired upon by a moving American tank at 600 meters. The fool must have been rattled. Such accuracy is a fantasy. The German mindset was so rigid, so certain of the laws of tank combat, that they couldn't believe the initial accounts. They assumed the Americans were simply getting lucky, or that their own veteran crews were becoming unnerved by the sheer number of enemy tanks. It took weeks of consistent, terrifying reports from multiple sectors before the German High Command began to suspect the truth. Analysts were stunned. Their intelligence profiles of the Sherman made no mention of such a sophisticated system. They were facing not just a new weapon, but a ghost, a capability that shouldn't exist, yet was killing their men and shattering their most fundamental combat doctrines. The tactical angle, rewriting the rules of attack. The Gyrostabilizer didn't just help the Sherman in a one-on-one fight, it fundamentally changed American armored tactics. The Germans had perfected the art of the static ambush, forcing their enemies to advance into a carefully prepared kill zone. The stabilizer gave the Americans the ultimate tool to break this strategy: momentum. Sherman platoons no longer had to halt to engage a suspected enemy position. Instead, they could use recon by fire, advancing at a steady crawl while their gunners scanned for targets and fired high-explosive shells into every suspicious hedgerow or tree line. For German anti-tank gun crews, this was a nightmare. Their greatest advantage was the element of surprise. Now they were being suppressed by an enemy that was actively shooting back before the ambush was even sprung. The advance never stopped. The pressure was relentless, and the psychological effect of facing an enemy that could move and shoot simultaneously was profoundly demoralizing. The industrial angle, the true American weapon. Perhaps the greatest shock for the German High Command was not the existence of the stabilizer, but its ubiquity. In the German army, advanced technology was reserved for elite units or specialized weapons, but in the American army, it was democratized. The stabilizer wasn't a rare upgrade. It was a standard-issue component installed in tens of thousands of tanks. The true American weapon wasn't the Sherman tank or the gyroscope. It was the Ford River Rouge plant and the Detroit tank arsenal. It was the industrial philosophy that believed in building not just more, but smarter, at a scale the world had never seen. The Germans, who handcrafted their Tigers and Panthers like expensive watches, couldn't believe that the Americans could mass-produce something as delicate as a gyroscopic stabilizer and make it rugged enough to work on a battlefield. It was a victory of mass-produced sophistication over bespoke perfection. The enemy point of view, the erosion of superiority. For the individual German tanker, this new reality was terrifying. His entire training and sense of superiority were built on the idea that his machine was better, his gun was better, and his aim was better. He was taught to be a duelist. But the Americans weren't interested in a duel. The sight of a Sherman advancing, its gun unnervingly steady, shattered this confidence. It felt like cheating. It was a violation of the established rules of combat. German veterans who had faced down entire Soviet tank corps were now horrified by the relentless advance of the Shermans. Their carefully aimed shots would often miss as the Sherman crested a rise or dipped into a hollow, while the American gun remained locked on their position. Slowly, dread replaced arrogance. They were fighting an enemy whose methods they couldn't comprehend, backed by an industrial power they couldn't hope to match. The turning point came in the last week of July, 1944. For weeks, the Allied advance had been bogged down in the treacherous Normandy bocage country. The dense, ancient hedgerows formed a nightmarish labyrinth of natural fortifications, perfect for the German defensive strategy. Concealed in these earthen walls, German Panthers, anti-tank guns, and machine gun nests bled the American forces for every yard. German commanders were confident. They had turned Normandy into a meat grinder, and they believed they could hold the line indefinitely. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. On July 25th, the sky itself seemed to catch fire. Operation Cobra began with one of the most concentrated aerial bombardments in history. Thousands of Allied bombers carpeted a narrow section of the German lines, creating a surreal landscape of smoke, craters, and pulverized earth. Through this man-made earthquake, the American armored divisions began to pour. For the stunned survivors of the elite German Panzer division, the chaos was unimaginable. Yet, as the initial shock wore off, their training took over. Major von Stolz, a battle-hardened commander of a Panther company, rallied his remaining tanks. He saw the columns of Shermans advancing through the smoke and dust, and despite the devastation, he saw an opportunity. The Americans were advancing recklessly, he thought, right into a perfect kill zone. He positioned his 3 remaining Panthers in a concealed flanking position, their long 75mm cannons aimed at the road where the Sherman column would have to pass. The doctrine was instinct. Let the lead tank enter the trap, destroy it with a single, precise shot, and then pick off the rest of the column as it descended into chaos, blocked by the burning wreckage. The lead Sherman rolled into his gunner's sights. "Fire!" von Stolz commanded. The Panther's gun barked, and the shell, travelling at over 3,000 feet per second, struck the Sherman's turret. The American tank shuddered to a halt, smoke billowing from the impact. A perfect ambush, a textbook kill. Von Stolz felt a grim satisfaction. Now, he thought, the rest will panic. But they didn't. What happened next was something for which his years of experience on the Eastern Front had left him utterly unprepared. The American column did not stop. Instead of halting or reversing in confusion, the other Shermans immediately swiveled their turrets toward the muzzle flash of the Panther. And while still rolling forward, they opened fire. A hailstorm of 75mm high-explosive shells erupted around von Stolz's position. The world became a deafening chaos of explosions and flying shrapnel. His gunner couldn't believe it. His carefully aimed crosshairs were being thrown off by the constant rocking of near misses. The Americans weren't aiming for a kill shot. They were firing to suppress, to blind, to overwhelm. And while they fired, they maneuvered, one platoon peeling right, another pushing left, their guns eerily steady as they advanced to flank the flankers. Major von Stolz was stunned. His Panthers, the pride of the Panzerwaffe, were trapped. They were designed for duels, not brawls. His gunner frantically tried to traverse and lay his powerful cannon on one of the flanking Shermans. But every time he got close, another high-explosive shell would impact nearby, throwing his aim off and forcing the crew to duck instinctively. The Shermans were a pack of wolves, constantly moving, constantly nipping, their fire coordinated and overwhelming. A 76mm armor-piercing round, fired from a Sherman that had gained a flanking position, slammed into the side of his wingman's Panther. The shell punched through the thinner side armor and ignited the ammunition inside. The tank erupted in a horrifying fireball. Moments later, his other Panther was disabled, its track shattered by a well-aimed shot. Von Stolz's own tank was now the sole focus of a dozen Shermans. He watched in horror as the steady gun barrels swiveled to face him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his superior armor meant nothing now. A volley of shells struck his tank. While most bounced off the thick frontal plate, one found the turret ring, jamming it. Another smashed the delicate Zeiss optic. His Panther was blind and toothless. "Bail out!" he screamed. He and his surviving crew scrambled from the escape hatches, diving into a nearby bomb crater as machine gun fire stitched the air where they had been. Lying in the dirt, his ears ringing, von Stolz watched the American column roll past. It was not a column, it was a river of steel, flowing relentlessly through the breach in the German lines. And on every single tank, the gun barrel remained steady, scanning, hunting. In that moment, he understood. They had not been defeated by a better tank. They had been defeated by a better idea. All their training, their superior guns, their thick armor, it was all worthless against an enemy that refused to stop. The Americans had weaponized momentum. This scene of tactical annihilation was repeated across the entire front of Operation Cobra. The German defensive doctrine, so effective for weeks, crumbled in a matter of hours. The static hedgehog positions were systematically overwhelmed by American armor that could suppress, maneuver, and destroy simultaneously. The breakout was total. The stalemate was broken. German units that had been models of tactical brilliance found themselves encircled and destroyed by an enemy they had profoundly underestimated. They were shocked to find that the Ronson they had mocked was the very instrument of their destruction, not because it was invincible, but because it was part of an unstoppable system of mobile warfare that they had no answer for. The collapse was faster and more total than anything the German High Command could have imagined. In the days and weeks following Operation Cobra, the meticulously constructed German front in France ceased to exist. What followed was a full-scale rout, what the jubilant Allies called the Great Swan. American armoured columns, led by the seemingly endless supply of Shermans, raced across the French countryside, bypassing strongpoints and encircling entire German divisions. The culmination of this disaster for the Wehrmacht was the Falaise Pocket, where the German 7th Army was trapped and systematically annihilated. The key to this encirclement was the incredible speed of the Allied advance, a speed made possible by an armoured force that did not need to stop to fight. The German forces, designed for a static, defensive war, were completely unprepared for this blitzkrieg in reverse. They were surprised by the ferocity and momentum of an enemy they had dismissed as tactically naive. In the captured interrogation reports and journals of German officers from this period, a new tone emerges. The arrogant confidence of early July is replaced by a sense of bewilderment and fatalism. A captured Panzer Oberleutnant from the 2nd Panzer Division, when asked why his unit was unable to halt the American advance, gave a response that perfectly captured the new reality. How do you set an ambush for a flood? We would prepare a position, wait for the Americans to come to us, but they never stopped. They would fire into our positions while still moving. Before we could get an accurate shot, our guns were suppressed, and our flanks were being turned. We never knew they could fight this way. We were prepared for a battle of quality against quantity, but we were not prepared for a battle against an opponent whose tactics seemed to have been invented on another planet. This sentiment was everywhere. The German tankers' deep-seated belief in their own superiority, the very core of their fighting spirit, had been broken. The Sherman was no longer a joke or a Ronson. It was the symbol of a terrifying new form of warfare. The final verdict on the Sherman and its revolutionary capability came from the Germans themselves. In a post-war interview, General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr division that was shattered during Operation Cobra, reflected on his command's destruction. He admitted his forces were completely bewildered by the American tactics. "We had no answer," he stated. "My men's morale, their belief in our superior equipment, was broken when they saw the Shermans advancing, always advancing, firing as they came. We planned for a static war of attrition and were met with a mobile war of annihilation. We completely and utterly underestimated not just the American tank, but the American doctrine that it was built for." The numbers told the brutal story. In the Falaise pocket alone, the Germans lost an estimated 50,000 soldiers captured and 10,000 killed, along with hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and artillery pieces. The campaign for France, which the Germans believed would be a bloody stalemate, was over in less than 3 months after the breakout. While Allied air power and numerical superiority were crucial, it was the unstoppable momentum of the armoured columns on the ground that made the encirclement and destruction possible. German tankers, once the confident masters of the battlefield, were now a hunted remnant, their powerful Panthers and Tigers often abandoned for lack of fuel or a minor mechanical issue. They had learned the hard way that a tank's individual specifications meant nothing if it could be overwhelmed by a system of warfare that it was never designed to fight. The humble Sherman, the tank they had laughed at, had not only won the battle, it had invalidated their entire philosophy of war. In the grand chronicle of the Second World War, the story of the Sherman's Gyrostabilizer is more than just a footnote in military hardware. It is a parable about two warring philosophies. The German war machine sought perfection, building magnificent, terrifying machines that were the pinnacle of traditional engineering, dueling weapons designed for the hands of masters. They believed in the supremacy of the individual weapon, the perfect sword that could not be beaten. But the Americans were not interested in a sword fight. They were fighting a modern industrial war, and they brought a modern industrial solution. The Sherman tank, humble and mass-produced, was not a duelist's weapon. It was a single, integrated component in a vast, unstoppable system of combined arms. The true genius of the American approach was the belief that game-changing technology should not be a luxury for the few, but a standard tool for the many. The quiet, humming gyroscope inside the Sherman's turret was the physical manifestation of this idea. It was a symbol of a nation that put its faith not in invincible machines, but in the momentum of its entire army, empowering the average soldier to be more lethal, more aggressive, and more effective. The German tankers, who laughed at the Sherman's shape, never understood that the true weapon was the idea behind it. They were defeated not by armor thickness or cannon caliber, but by a doctrine of relentless, mobile warfare that their own philosophy had no answer for. The steady gun barrel of the moving Sherman was the harbinger of a new age, proving that in a war of attrition, the side that can master momentum and mass-produce innovation will not just win the battle, it will redefine the battlefield itself. The laughter in the hedgerows of 1944 was ultimately silenced by the hum of 1,000 gyroscopes and a river of steel that never, ever stopped.